Hi there, Derek Reimer here. So I've recently begun a new project called Level, which is a team communication platform for software teams who have grown a bit weary from Slack constantly interrupting them throughout the day. One of the interesting things about this project is I've chosen to build the core of it as open source, so that affords me a bit more flexibility to do things like live code out in public. So what I want to do is run an experiment. I want to try just recording myself building a simple feature into Level. I don't plan to edit this much at all, really just let it be raw, unfiltered coding time. Let me know if you find it interesting. You may want to install a plugin in your browser to speed up the playback time a little bit in case there's some dead time in there. But really, I've been a goal of mine is to share as much as possible about the whole process of building this product. And so, I look forward to hearing your feedback and finding out if this was interesting for you. And without further ado, let's get to it. All right. So the feature I want to build is adding a connection to a specific resource type in GraphQL. And I'll explain a bit more about sort of the domain objects in play here just so it makes a bit more sense. So a space in Level is basically a company or an organization, or Slack would probably call it a workspace, and it basically defines kind of the boundaries around a team that you're on. And a group is akin to sort of a channel. It's basically the place where you can either assemble your teams, like you could have a development team or a marketing team as a group, or you could assemble a group around a specific topic that people are interested in, like parents or dad jokes or something like that. So that's sort of the domain objects in play. And I just recently today added the ability to create a group inside of a space. And so I can just quickly show you how that works right here. Whoops, I need to start my server. Looks like some file change that caused the auto reload to stop working. Okay, we're up and running. So refresh my token. Okay. So one of the cool things that you get with the Absinthe library in Elixir is it automatically installs graphical, I believe it's how it's pronounced. It's basically a GraphQL API explorer that Facebook built, and I think others have extended. And it basically installs it on a specific route that you configure so that you can play with your GraphQL API right in the browser, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to just show you real quick that I can create a group. So there's my create group mutation type. And I can give it a name. Let's call it live coding. Why not? And then I can say return back the success, return back the group itself, and give me the ID and the name, and then give me back any errors. The details of this doesn't really matter. What matters most is I'm going to show you that this basically creates a group object when I run the mutation. And so there it is. It created it successfully, gave me back the name, and it gave me the ID that was generated, and there were no errors in the process of creating that group. If I flip over here to our structure file, which is basically the database schema, I can go down to groups. Oops. Wow. There we go. So these are the columns that the groups table has. It basically has a state, whether the group is open or closed, has a name, has a description, has a privacy boolean, and then it's connected to obviously the space and also the user who created the group, and just some timestamps and stuff. So pretty basic stuff here. Not a lot of metadata attached to them. All that's required really is a name and some of this other metadata that gets set automatically. So what I want to be able to do is say, for the current viewer, I can pull out the space already right now. Let's just run this for show. Okay, so I'm in a space that's called level, and I want to be able to say, give me back groups. And I say, maybe I want the first 10, and I want back the names of the first 10 groups. But if I run that, query field groups does not exist on space. So this is basically what I need to implement, is this ability to query for groups. So how do we do that? Well, in Absinthe, which is the library for GraphQL, at the core of it is this schema file. And it uses this Absinthe schema module and pulls in a bunch of stuff to basically provide a DSL for us to define our GraphQL types. So you can see here that our base query just has one field in it, and that is for the current viewer. And this corresponds to whatever user is currently authenticated. And all the other things are basically built for the purpose of querying. All the other types kind of hang off of this viewer field, and everything else can be obtained by exploring the graph off of the current logged in user. So I'm pulling in some other things. Basically, this schema types module has a bunch of other types defined in it. This schema file is pretty slim. So if I jump over there, you'll see that I have several objects defined here. I have my user, I have my space, and I have an invitation, which is sort of part of the logic for inviting additional users to the space. And I have my newly created group object. And basically what I want to do is add a field to the space object that allows one to pull out all the groups. And I can show you how one of these works. We're calling it a connection because it's basically a pattern that was established, I believe it was by React Relay, perhaps. But basically it's a pattern for providing a paginated result set as a field. So it accepts a consistent set of arguments. In this case, it's first, last, before, and after, and an order by argument to determine the ordering. And of course, we can add more to that, but that's sort of the minimum set for performing pagination. So let me just show you real quick how we would pull users off of a space, because this will give us a sort of demonstrate how it goes. So if I say users and I say I want a first 10, and let's just get the, okay, so we want our edges, and actually GraphQL will auto fill in the minimum necessary fields in here for us. So this gives me back an array of edges that have nodes, that have IDs, and I can get the first name off of users, and that shows that I've created two. There's me and there's Tiffany in here also. So I want to be able to do a similar thing, but for groups. So I'm going to start out with a test, actually. So let's go down to tests. Okay. So under level web, I have my GraphQL directory, where I'm storing my tests for both mutations and queries. And this is a query. So I'm going to create a new test file. I'm going to call it groups test. So to get a jumping off point, one of my favorite hacks is just to look at an existing test file that's pretty similar to what we need and using it as a starting point. So if I go over to my space test, I'll see that I already have a test in which I am running a query and getting back a paginated result set. So this looks like a good candidate to be reused. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this test file and come over to my groups test and rename my test file, obviously, groups test. And I want to test that spaces have a paginated groups field. Okay. And then, so for the current viewer and their space, I want to get groups. And an edge here is just it's a type that wraps a node, and an edge contains the node, and it also contains a cursor ID. And the details of that aren't really necessary here, but just to provide a little more context. Whoops. So I think it's most interesting to pull the name of the group out, and that way we can actually verify. Okay. So we want groups, we want edges, so what I'm going to do is actually, in the setup here, I already am performing a sign-up operation basically, and this inserts a user and a space. And so it's returning back a result that contains the user and the space as a result of this sign-up operation that just ran. And then I'm basically taking the default connection provided, and I'm performing authentication here. And so that the connection, when I attempt to run GraphQL here with this connection, authentication will already be established. So what I would need to do is insert a group to assert that it actually returns back that group. And I actually like to accumulate these helpers helpers for doing operations like inserting a group or inserting a signup in my test helpers file. So I'm going to open that up just so we can see that. So here I have a bunch of functions that just provide valid parameters for these different types of operations. And then I have these insert functions that actually do the operation. And so I already have an insert group function here, and this just calls out to my groups context and a function called create group, and basically does the whole operation for me. So I can use that as a shortcut here and just say, I want to create a new group, and say insert group. Okay, so this inserts a group. Oh, and I need to pass in my user actually. That's the piece I missed. So this inserts a group on behalf of this user into that user's space. And so it should, when this is implemented, it should appear in this group's connection. And I should expect that the total count would be 1 because I just inserted my first group. And that should be actually camel cased. And I should expect, actually, let's not worry about that right now. Let's just start with a count and getting the name back. So we're expecting 1, and I'm expecting the name to be group.name. My group that I created up here, asserting the name is in here. This is looking pretty good. Let's save this and flip back over to my console, and let's run our tests. Okay, so I see that we are getting an error that we expected. It's a similar result that we saw in the graphical console, that cannot query field groups on space, because we obviously haven't implemented it yet. So let's get implementing. So like I mentioned before, it all sort of starts in this schema file. And of course, we don't have most of our types implemented in here, so I'm going to jump over to my types file. This is where the space is actually implemented. And I need to add a field. And I'm going to just grab one of these like this. Mind you, this doesn't exist yet because this is another basically input object that I'm going to need to define also. But for the sake of iterating, let's just leave that here. And this order by, you'll see that it's custom based on the field type, and that's because different objects are able to be ordered by different fields, and so they each need their own custom one defined. So that'll make more sense in a minute, but let's just call this one group order. And then my resolver for this, which is basically the function that does the actual work of fetching the groups, that should live at level.connections.groups. Okay. Let's run our tests again and see if we get a different... okay. Now we get a hard failure. So let's just jump over to input objects first. And I'm going to use this as a starting point. And this is the field and a direction to sort groups. This is called group order. And this is a scalar type. And it kind of represents the different set of possible fields by which groups can be ordered. So I call it group order field. And the sort direction is always just this order direction type, which has two options, ascending or descending. So that looks good. Let's get over to our enumerables here. And I want to start by only allowing these to be ordered by name. It seems to make the most sense for groups. Okay. So I have that. I also need to implement this group connection. And so I have this connections file under the schema. And there's two pieces I'm going to need. I need to define the connection type, and then I also need to define the edge type. So I'm going to just use these two as a starting point. And I'm going to call this my group edge. I'm going to call this my group connection. Group groups. Now this node type is not an invitation. It should be a group. This cursor is this cursor type. That works. This should be a group edge. Okay. So this is sort of a pattern that I do a lot. It's just sort of follow the chain around and see what similarly defined objects exists already and use those as my starting point. It really helps to have some of these patterns already established. Okay. Let's see what we get after adding these types. Whoa. So this is a big old stack trace, basically telling me that this group's connection function is undefined, which is what we expect. So this is under the level namespace, and so we can go up here and take a peek at what's going on up here. So I have this connections context that contains these functions, and we need to define a similar one to these. So I'm going to use this as again, as a starting point. I want to fetch groups for a given space. And I'm going to use a little groups. Still accepts a space. It's chained off of spaces, so that still works as the first argument. This time it's going to be groups.get. And so this looks one level deeper in nesting into the connections namespace, and we'll see that we have an invitations module and we have a users module, but we don't yet have a groups module here. So I'm going to create one of these. And once again, I'm going to use this as a starting point and rename my module. And this we want groups, group, and So I use sort of the same pattern in all these connection modules. And right here, I'm defining basically the default arguments. So in the case of this, where I'm only providing, say, one of the arguments, I need to have defaults set for the others. So this is where this is happening. And I want to default to name ascending. And all these others can be blank. This is groups. And it should actually look quite similar to this, except I want to say group, and we can rename our helper variable here too. And we want the group space ID to be the same as our space ID. This state is not important. Let's remove that. And you can see we have this pagination module, which I won't go into right now, but basically we can pass this base query in, and then the pagination module, or this fetch result function in the pagination module, takes that base query and also takes our other arguments. So the other arguments related to pagination being first, last, before, and after. And it automatically appends the necessary query params to this base query and then executes it for us. So this is sort of an abstraction that was made early on because I found that we needed to basically perform the same type of operation on many different base queries. So that does most of the heavy lifting for us. I think that should be good. Let's see if our tests agree. Our tests are passing. It looks like we have a warning here. So it's in our connections test, line 5. Let's see what's going on here. I can just nuke that. Run our test one more time. Okay, we're passing. Now the moment of truth. Let's see if we can get groups. Well, actually, I'll refresh my page. I should extend the token expiration time on this, but for now, there we go. Okay, so let's just make sure we can get our viewer. Yes. So I should be able to look up the space, and then I should be able to say groups, first 10. And then this is edges, nodes, names. Hey, there we go. So we have the group we just created, which is called live coding, and the group developers. We can also get any other attributes we want because this is GraphQL. So I can maybe say insert at time and name. There we go. Very cool. So let's commit. This seems like a good time to commit. And let's just sort of review the changes we made. So in this connections context module, we added a groups function that does the heavy lifting of fetching things. Oh, looks like we missed. See, code comments do always fall out of date, don't they? So this should be a group. Okay. And we defined our new object types for the sake of GraphQL. And we added this groups field to the space object. And we fix this warning. Cool. So let's say implement groups connection on spaces. Now, I actually should have done that on a different branch, but that's okay. Went straight on to master. Cowboy coding up in here. Okay. And that seems like a good time for a break. I will be right back, and you won't know the difference. Okay, so let's review where we're at. The original to-do list in the issue had basically 3 different tasks. One was to add a paginated groups field to spaces, and we just accomplished that. Another is to accept a state argument in addition to order to filter by open or closed. So it's basically, most of the time we probably don't want to include closed groups in the list. So we want to default to only showing open ones, but also offer the ability to tease out the closed groups. So that still needs to be done. And default to ordering by name in ascending order, that is actually complete already. So we just have this one final piece left. It's also worth noting, too, that this will need to get expanded a bit, and I filed some follow-up issues already as they were top of mind when I was filing this one, that one, we need to make sure that we only show groups that the user is actually allowed to see. So if a private group has been created by one user, then it's not immediately visible to all the other users. And right now, I'm kind of holding off on that piece because we don't really have any of the permissions type of architecture built around groups just yet. Also, we should set an upper bound on limiting the number of groups allowed in one page. And right now, there's not really a limit. You'll see that I am accumulating just a small amount of technical debt, which needs to get paid down eventually. You'll see in this Validateargs function in here where that gets called at the top of this function. That would be probably the right place to make sure that, for example, someone's not saying, give me the first 500 groups. But right now we have this to-do comment in here that's basically a punt on doing any kind of validation on those args. So not the best. We should probably have an issue filed for this. But one cool thing that we do have sort of keeping an eye on this is Credo, which is a static analysis tool. And if I run it, you'll see that all of these to-do comments show up as software design suggestions. So basically, they're not failing hard, but it's saying, like, by the way, you have these to-do comments and you should not leave these around forever. So this is a good reminder, at least, that so these won't completely fall off of my radar. So follow-up issues, these are good. We'll get to those later, but for now, let's just get to implementing this state filtering. So let's go back to our test file. And that would be under a groups test. So I basically want another test. Test that we can filter groups by state. Test filtering groups by state. I don't know. And we need our connection and our user. And I'm seeing that I'm about to copy some stuff and introduce some repetition here. And I think there's an opportunity to at least eliminate some of that. I probably will use, well, let's see. Actually, we won't reuse the same query. So maybe for now we won't try to dry anything up. We'll just move ahead. So what we need to do is insert, well, there's a few ways we can go about it. Let's insert an open group. And a closed group. And closed group will actually not, both will be open by default. So we need to, for now, set the closed group, make sure it has a closed status. I'm sorry, closed state. And we don't have a built-in way to do that just yet. We haven't implemented a function in our groups context to close a group or even update a group. So there's a few different ways I could see going about this. We could just perform the database update right there in the test. I think that's really our only option right now, unless we want to go implement specific domain-specific logic to kind of encapsulate the closing of a group. I would probably, for now, just do the database update, but I don't think we want to keep it that way forever. I prefer to use sort of the built-in functions defined in our contexts to do those types of changes, so that we're not sprinkling sort of the logic of how to close a group throughout test files and other parts of the code base. But for the sake of brevity right now, we'll go ahead and just manually update this closed group to be in a closed state. So we can say, actually I'm going to need to consult the docs on this because I am still learning my Elixir patterns. So let's see what we've got. So I can say update and basically pass a change, an active change set change. So I think this will work. So we have our closed group, and I want to make an ecto change set change. And when you do this kind of piping, it puts this argument into the first position here. So whatever I type here will actually be in the second position. So I want to change the state to closed. And then I want to say repo update. And actually this is going to return a success tuple, so I think that's what we want. And basically I want to run a query and assert that the open group is returned and the closed one is not when I filter by open state. So let's give this a shot. Here's my query. I want the first two is fine, but I want to say state is open. I'm going to put spaces here. Let's do the same up here, actually. That's cleaner. State is open. And I'm going to shortcut some of this as well. And we should only get a total count of 1, and we should only get the open group back. Okay. Let's try this out. Closed group is unused. That's okay. Unknown argument state. So that is as expected. So let's get to implementing, shall we? So here I want to add an arg, and I want it to be state. And the nice thing about GraphQL is we get a type system. So we can, similar to what we did with the order by, where we had different options for that, we can also accept a special type here. Let's call it group state. And I believe that was defined over here in our input objects. This would count as an Well, actually, I think we could safely put this as an enumerable because this is basically a type that only has a few select values available to it. And looks like we already have it defined actually. Group state is already defined. Must have used that somewhere else, so I think we're good. So let's see what our tests say now. So I think I actually don't need quotes because it's not technically a string. It's actually a static type in and of itself. So let's try this. Okay. So I can fix this warning, but so it looks like we expected to get only one group back, but instead got two back. And so that is clear that the filtering is not actually happening, which is what we expect. Okay, my warning is that this is unused, and that is true. We actually don't even need to capture this, so I can just get rid of that, and that should be sufficient. We're basically creating it, and then we're updating it to a closed state and moving on. So that is fine. Looks like our indentation got a little crazy here. That looks better. Okay. So this resolver basically needs to now properly handle this state. So let's go to where that's defined, which is over in connections. And we should expect it in the args. We should also add a default arg here. So remember, according to our spec, we wanted it to default to open. So perhaps for the sake of making the test more rigorous, we should instead assert, let's flip it. Let's say I do want to capture this, and we don't need to capture open group. And then let's make it so that instead of open ones, we're actually looking for closed ones, and give me back a closed group. So that way, this would fail even with that default in place. And I think it would be a good idea to verify that we're still failing even after I added this default. Cool, we are. And okay, so now this args hash should be containing, let's actually try an io dot puts how about I'm sort of shooting in the dark here now. Okay. That worked better. So I just outputted to the console the args that are coming in, and we're showing that in this case, state is coming through as one of these, just proving out that we are in fact receiving those in the args. So what we need to do is conditionally append it to this base query. And so we can do that. Well, let's start with a case. Let's say so if a state is given in the args, then let's pull it out. Otherwise, we should handle that case as well, in case that it's not in the args. So we can say base query equals, and this is probably worth consulting. I'm actually going to look over in my pagination module to remind myself how we can chain these ecto queries together. Because I basically want to take a query and then apply some more things to it. So here's what we can do. We can say from so how we just constructed this, I can say from G in base query where G dot state equals state. And I've basically just added additional where parameters to the base query by saying from this thing in our base query that we just defined up here. So it's pretty cool, pretty powerful that you can do this kind of chaining. Otherwise, we say, well, we should actually always have a state in the args, because in the case that it's not passed in explicitly, it gets merged in as the default. So I actually don't think we need this case after all. I'm going to kind of rewind this back and say just I'm just going to extract. Yeah, I don't even need to do that. I can actually rewind this whole thing, because all I need to do is say I think that'll work. Let's try that. Let's click sub mix test. Yeah, okay. Very good. So we could certainly test more scenarios. I think this is kind of the minimum, at least the minimum viable that we need to gain confidence that this is actually working as we expect. In this case, we didn't explicitly pass a state, so we know it's working in the default mode. And here we verified that it is in fact filtering down by closed when we explicitly pass in that state. So I'm feeling pretty confident in this. I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes. You'll see I also cheated. During my break, I went ahead and peeled that commit off into a separate branch so that it wasn't sitting on master. Okay. These changes look good, nice and succinct. And I'll go ahead and push these up. Going back to our original list, I think that pretty much satisfies it. I also opened a pull request during the break, just so we can easily see in total what's going on. So here it is, and yeah, I think this one's looking pretty good. I will go ahead and wrap up for now, but I hope you enjoyed this, and once again, please do let me know if this was interesting, and I hope to do more of these in the future. See you next time.